Hi, I'm Jeff Sweet. In my last talk, I described the scene in Henry VI in which Queen Margaret, having captured the rebellious Duke of York, tortures him with a couple of transformed objects, a handkerchief that's stained with the blood of his youngest son, and a crown made of paper, which he mockingly places on his head. Well, there's a moment before these objects are introduced that I want to talk about now to introduce a new idea. When her followers bring the captured York to her, they ask her, well, what do you want us to do with him? And she says, make him stand upon this molehill here. So why does Shakespeare have her stand him on a molehill? Well, what is a molehill? It's a little elevation. So by putting him on a molehill, she is mocking his presumptuousness that he could so ascend in the world as to be able to overthrow her husband, Henry VI, and become king. So we, on stage, tend to associate height with status. I mean, think of Evita, up on the balcony. For that matter, think of all the places, shows that have balconies. Height tends to also be connected with aspiration. It's Romeo looking up at Juliet, right? Or Cyrano looking up at Roxanne. So yes, you can negotiate over height on stage. Another famous instance of royalty and height is in The King and I. Maybe you remember that the king has decreed that nobody's head may be higher than his. At the end of the first act, he has just given ground. He has just granted Anna something that she wants. But now, to show who's boss, nonetheless, he starts to lower his head. And in a sign that she's willing to play ball with him for the moment at any rate, Anna lowers her head. Though it's a little bit more difficult for her to do this because she's wearing a hoop skirt. But finally, they get to the point where both of their heads are almost to the ground. And if I remember correctly, Oscar Hammerstein's stage direction at this point reads, who is taming whom? There's another famous negotiation over height, a comic one in Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. Adenoid Hinkle, who is Chaplin's version of Adolf Hitler, invites his guest Napoleone, a comic version of Mussolini, to join him in his private barber shop, and they sit in these two barber chairs. And Hinkle notices that Napoleone's chair is a little higher than his, so he cranks his up a little bit. Napoleone notices, he cranks his up a little bit, and at first it's, almost surreptitious, and then they are overtly into a cranking race until they're practically flattened against the ceilings, and the chairs are so high that barbers couldn't possibly reach them. Now, negotiating over height, that's just one way that you can negotiate over space. Many stories, in fact, both on stage or on screen, are based in this idea of the negotiating over territory, who has primacy over a location. The Jets and Sharks, they're battling over a neighborhood. All those Westerns, Shane, The Magnificent Seven, Once Upon a Time in the Old West, The Unforgiven, My Darling Clementine, all of them, The Westerner, all these are about who is going to dominate over this hunk of land. The same is true of war movies, of course, and gangster movies, whether it's The Longest Day or The Untouchables. Again, the battle is over who is going to dominate. Territorial conflicts are also common on stage, although they may be on a different scale than Omaha Beach or Tombstone, or who has liquor distribution rights in what Chicago neighborhoods during Prohibition. For example, John Guare's 6 Degrees of Separation. It's about a young man who assumes an identity to con his way into a social circle that ordinarily would be beyond his reach. And having conned his way in, he is able to con them in a lot of other ways. David Henry Wang's The Golden Child concerns the introduction of Christianity into a traditional Chinese merchant's home and the havoc this wreaks on the merchant and his 3 wives. To return to Henry VI, Margaret starts off as a minor French princess who marries a weak English king and so dominates him, so changes and destabilizes her husband's court that she triggers a bloody civil war. Now, all of these plays involve the disruption that occurs when outsiders breach new worlds. Single set plays are particularly liable to concern themselves with the battle over territory because the set usually represents the home or power base of one character or a group of characters. When people from the outside appear, the dramatic issue is whether the newcomers are going to take over. I sometimes think of these as invasion plays. A lot of plays are invasion plays, a lot of great ones. I mean, Blanche invades Stanley's kingdom in A Streetcar Named Desire, and Felix more or less invades Oscar's apartment in The Odd Couple. You can negotiate over smaller territory too. One of my favorite scenes illustrating this is in an episode of MASH. I mean, we're talking about the classics, right? MASH with there's a scene with Alan Alda and Blythe Danner. And Alda is professing his love for Blythe Danner. And as he professes his love, you know, and how much he wants to marry her, the more he protests this, he keeps moving backwards away from her until he ends up practically cowering in a corner. And she laughs and she makes him look at his own behavior, how what he's saying and what he's doing are absolutely contradictory. So this is an example of negotiating over space on a more personal level. You can negotiate over time too. That's what the term timing addresses, the subtle meaning that can be invested in an action or a speech through the way a performer plays with speed, hesitation, momentum, etc. The same text spoken with different timing changes the meaning of the text. For instance, do you love me? Yes. Versus, do you love me? Yes. The second version suggests that there is cause for doubt. Harold Pinter was famously concerned with beats and pauses in his scripts, and he scored them very specifically. In fact, there's one anecdote, it's probably apocryphal, but I like it. There's one anecdote in which he was asked for a revision of the scene, and he responded by adding a pause. We can also negotiate over light. In the thriller by Frederick Knott called Wait Until Dark, the lead woman is blind. She's being menaced by crooks who have taken over her apartment. And finally, it comes down to a battle between her and the lead villain. Maybe if you saw the film, you remember it's Audrey Hepburn versus Alan Arkin. Anyway, ultimately, her big advantage is that since she is blind, when she turns out the light, she has the advantage because she knows her apartment backwards and forwards. And since he isn't blind, he can't negotiate his way around it the way she can. There's a negotiation over light, a great one, in A Streetcar Named Desire. Blanche is very careful, you may remember, about the light in which she is seen, and she puts Japanese lanterns over the bulbs in Stanley and Stella's apartment to soften the light. Towards the end of the play, when Mitch has been told unpleasant truths about Blanche, Stanley has told her this stuff, he arrives at the apartment to confront her. And he takes her over to the one of the lights in the apartment, and he rips off the colored lantern and sees her in the glare of a naked light bulb. And now he sees, yeah, that she's older than he thought, and that she's lived a harder life than he thought. It's another great negotiation over light, and one that Tennessee Williams explicitly wrote into the script. And while we're talking about Streetcar, certainly the characters are affected by the temperature. You know, after all, the play takes place in New Orleans in a world without air conditioning, and that certainly impacts the behavior of the characters. It certainly has something to do with the fact that they're not going to be overdressed, and with why Blanche constantly is taking baths. And you can negotiate over sound, especially volume. A line shouted will mean something different than the same line whispered. And speaking of sound, you can negotiate over music. One of the great moments in film history is in Casablanca. Maybe you remember there's a point where the Nazis who are in Rick's bar, they start singing some Nazi song, and the other people in the bar who can't stand the Nazis drown them out by singing the Marseillaise. And most crucially, most importantly, I think, People often negotiate over other people. I mean, we see a lot in real life, right? I mean, in a divorce, a couple will often negotiate over their children who will have what custody and visitation rights. Yeah. Well, a lot of plays are based on characters competing to see who's going to win the loyalty, lover, affection of other characters. In Streetcar, yeah, we're back to Streetcar again. Blanche and Stanley negotiate over both Stella and Mitch. Blanche makes a good effort, but ultimately Stanley, fighting dirty, wins both Stella and Mitch. And another of my favorite plays, the play that Ruth and Augustus gets adapted from Henry James's novella Washington Square, The Heiress. The title character, the heiress, Catherine, is the territory that her cynical suitor, Morris, and her condescending father go to war over. But, you know, I could go on endlessly discussing plays in which characters use other characters as mediums of negotiation. In fact, it's almost automatic that when you have three characters on stage, two of them will get into a context over who is going to lay claim to the third. In fact, I could talk for a great deal longer, giving examples of all these kinds of negotiations, negotiating over space, time, temperature, sound. My hunch is that if you take a look at your favorite scripts from this perspective, you're going to find other examples of negotiations that make the stories more vivid.